Hi everyone, I hope you're really enjoying your 2 inset days in September. Thank you for joining this session. I'm sorry I can't actually be there to deliver on the day and you're getting a recorded version. But as many of you might know, I've moved on and started my new role as of the 1st of September. But I know I will have met many of you before, but for those of you I've not met, my name's Jo Ashcroft, and for 5 years I was the Director of Education for Aspire, so I'll have worked with many of you before. This session is a bit of a whistle-stop tour, really, as the title says, navigating the evidence base to identify high-impact catch-up interventions, with really kind of this being especially applicable at the moment due to the current COVID catch-up funding that there is, and the fact that we're getting children back into school after a prolonged spell and a prolonged time off. Each page of this presentation you will find a sound button, and if you just click on that and I'll walk you through the presentation, and there'll be opportunities for you to stop and go and look at other bits or return to those and follow some links, or just kind of return to them at a later point. I hope you find it useful. Thank you. So at this point, it might be that you want to pause and you want to reflect a little bit on what we mean by evidence-informed practice, and really think actually what does that mean to you as a practitioner, whether you're in the early stages of your teaching career, whether you're working in a support role within the classroom, whether you're a school leader, but really what you understand by evidence-informed practice, as there is going to be a requirement when we're using the COVID catch-up premium to use evidence-informed approaches, and also an opportunity to reflect on what sources of evidence you do use currently, or what sources you think you could use, because we're going to really unpick that together within this presentation. And second of all, within here, there is a statement: if you're not using evidence, then what are you using? So Kevin Collins, who was the former chief exec of the Education Endowment Foundation, once stated, if you're not using evidence, then you must be using something. Some of you will have heard me talk about that before. So an opportunity to reflect before you move on to the next slide, where we'll consider those two things. So when we talk about evidence-informed practice, we're really talking about the way in which we as educationalists and practitioners use external robust sources of evidence that are available to us, many of which we're going to have a look at today, but how we also use our professional expertise and balance the two together. It's not about just using evidence, and it's not about just using our professional expertise. It's about using the two of those in a combined and blended way, and that's what we mean by evidence-informed practice. And in terms of what Sir Kevin Collins said, he said, if you're not using evidence, then you must be using prejudice. And that's that if we use just professional expertise, we can be using, the favoured views of our friends, people that we have access to, experiences that we've had, which are always going to be limited to a certain small context. Whereas by using evidence and robust external evidence, we're getting a less biased and a less prejudiced view. That again, I'll come on to this a little bit further on, but the Education Endowment Foundation once said, when they'd conducted a large number of trials, that only about 1 in 5, about 20% of trials and things that they investigated actually had a positive impact on outcomes for learners. So it meant that was better than what we would have been otherwise doing, than the business as usual approach. Yet about 98% of people engaged in the trials reported them to be really successful and really positive. So that just shows, without meaning to, we invest in things and we think really positively about those things because we've invested within it. Whereas that use of evidence alongside our professional expertise helps to dispel and reduce that bias a little, and that prejudice a little. The focus of the session today is really a sort of a general look at evidence and some of the sources of evidence that are really easily available to us. The sources of evidence available to us are enormous, and I simply couldn't talk about all of the sources, but some of the really readily available sources of evidence I'm going to talk through today. But I wanted to start as well. There is actually the Education Endowment Foundation just about a week ago produced a document which was the EEF Guide to Supporting School Planning, and and a tiered approach for 2020-21, obviously the post-COVID year. And I've put a link within that in case you want to have a look at that document, which I suggest you do. It's really, really useful. But many of the sources of evidence that are referenced within that, we're going to have a walkthrough and a whistle-stop tour of now together. We're going to start with a walk through the Teaching and Learning Toolkit, which is published by the Education Endowment Foundation, and also it was in partnership with the Sutton Trust, who are based at Durham University. Many of you will have seen the Teaching and Learning Toolkits before. Statistically, about 60% of you will have seen them before, but I wanted to give you sort of a bit of a reminder about some of the information within there and how to use it. The Teaching and Learning Toolkit doesn't show you individual trials of individual approaches. It's what's called a meta-analysis, which is where a number of studies under a similar theme have been grouped together and an average effect size created, and that being done a number of times under each theme to give us an average effect size. So what it gives us is sort of a really good headline as to where we might look to get our highest impact with learners. Every strand within it will show you, so for example, it's really small on there, but I have put a link in. You may want to pause after this slide and follow the link and go and have a look. But for example, arts participations, the top one on the list there, they're organised alphabetically on that list. It will always tell you the additional months progress. What it doesn't give, what it does behind the scenes give you is a statistical sort of impact, but in terms of usability for the user, it gives you an average month's impact. So if you were to implement that approach really well, the average impact that there has been over 12 months is an additional month's progress or a negative month's progress. It will also give you an average cost per pupil. If you follow the Teaching and Learning Toolkit link, there is in fact a user guide, which if you're really interested, you can go and look and see how those effect sizes are calculated. You can see how the cost is calculated, and the other thing it gives you is an evidence security rating. So there may be something that appears to be really high impact, but it may have a padlock rating of only 1 padlock, and therefore the evidence strength is reasonably weak. It might be something like metacognition or peer tutoring, where the evidence strength is 4 padlocks, so the evidence strength is really reasonably strong. As it says in the slide here, it gives you an idea of the best bets. It tells you what has worked on or what hasn't worked based on other people's experience. It is a historical snapshot in time. It doesn't tell you what will work in your classroom this year, but it does tell you what in a reasonably robustly measured way has worked for other people at that point in time. So it's a really good starting point for telling us about the evidence, but it doesn't promise us, if you do this, it'll happen, because it's all historical and a snapshot in time. We're going to look a little bit more at the Teaching and Learning Toolkit over the next few slides. This slide really just reiterates what I've just said, which is it does report averages and it doesn't offer guarantees. There's a slide that I can show you in a few slides' time, which will reiterate that a little bit further, but it gives us the average impact for that approach across a whole load of studies. It is a meta-analysis. So each of these strands generally covers quite a large number of studies, and it tells you the average effect size. It could be that somebody, an average effect size might be plus 3 months, but actually some people might have had 0 months impact, some may have had plus 7 months impact, some may have had minus 3. It's just kind of a reminder really that it doesn't offer you a guarantee, it is an average effect size. So I'd suggest after this point that you perhaps follow the link to the Teaching and Learning Toolkit and have a real play around with it. What you can do, if you notice across the top, I've just done screenshots from the Teaching and Learning Toolkit. You can order it by toolkit strand, and therefore it will be ordered alphabetically. You can order it by cost, so you can order it in ascending or descending cost of approach, or of evidence strength. It may be that you think I'm only really interested in things with a stronger evidence strength, so you order it in that way. Here you can see impact in months on the right hand side is the one that's highlighted, and that's because I've ordered the toolkit in terms of impact. And over the next 4 slides, there's a sound bite on this slide, sorry, but over the next 3 slides there isn't. It's just of interest really, to give you an illustration of the things that are the highest impact. The Teaching and Learning Toolkit is a live document, so it can change over time, but I screenshot this in the last week, so hopefully this is pretty up to date. I'm not aware that it's changed since. So for example, feedback is a really low cost approach, is a reasonable evidence strength, a middle evidence strength, and the impact is +8 months. That's the highest impact approach there is at the moment in this body of evidence, is around high quality feedback. So when we're looking for effective use of our time in terms of supporting learners to catch up, feedback gives us a really pretty good place to start. Metacognition and self-regulation is +7 months, and again, it's low cost, £1 sign, but high evidence strength. There's 4 padlocks there, so it's classed as extensive evidence base for that. Reading comprehension strategies, the same, but +6 months impact there. So as you go through this slide and the next 3, it's worth having a look. It's ordered in impact, and just have a bit of time for reflection on, do any of those things surprise you? Are there any approaches you're doing that actually are shown to be low impact, or vice versa? And perhaps at this moment, actually stop on the Teaching and Learning Toolkit and go and have a look, and you can click into any one of those strands and find a wealth of information behind each of those strands about the approaches, about the trials that sit behind those. So when you've had a look through that, you might have seen that, found some surprises, find some things exactly as you would expect. But what's really important is that you don't just look at the headlines of that toolkit, and you use those headlines as a way to click in, delve further, and find out more information about the approaches that there are suggested within there. For example, it should open a conversation within your team about what approaches you might use, particularly if you're thinking COVID catch-up at the moment. You might be thinking, should we use that money for one-to-one tutoring? We all know there's going to be a grant available for tutoring for children. Should we be doing small group tuition? Should we be doing peer tutoring? And I always think those 3 together are actually a really good illustration of how to use the Teaching and Learning Toolkit. So one-to-one tuition is expensive, £4 sign, so one of the more expensive approaches that are on the Teaching and Learning Toolkit. But the evidence strength is really strong, and it's +5 months. You know, if you could guarantee an additional 5 months of progress over the course of a year, that's a really strong approach to use. However, when you compare small group tuition, you might balance that and think, okay, well, actually the cost is lower than one-to-one tuition. The impact is also lower. The swings and roundabouts of times you may want to use those when you need that extra month of progress in the run up to assessment or transition points. Perhaps that's the approach you'd go for. When you're not nearing a transition or an assessment point, perhaps you'd go for small group tuition. Peer tutoring, really interestingly, is on there. Now, that is the exact same impact on here as one-to-one tuition is, and the evidence strength is the same, and it is so much cheaper. However, this is where it becomes really useful to actually click into the approaches and also to find out a little bit more about them. Peer tutoring, with all of these, it's if they're done really well, this is the impact. And peer tutoring is notoriously difficult to do really well, for example. So like I said, I'd love to be able to sort of talk about more of those individually, but actually the important bit is the fact that these should be a starting point for our conversations, and should be a starting point for our conversations about what approaches we might use. So if you're thinking post-COVID about what approaches you might use, what targeted approaches you might use to support catch-up and the post-COVID catch-up, these are some of the strands from the Teaching and Learning Toolkit that you could look at that are to do with targeted support for children, academic support. And there is individualised instruction, is an additional 3 months. That's all to do with how much you target exactly at the point of need for every individual. Within class attainment grouping, so that's not setting, that's not streaming, that's if you look at different grouping your children by ability within your classroom, Again, this is another example of a strand where it is really important to click into it. Don't just take the headline information, because when you break that down, as a general rule, your lower prior attaining pupils in your class will make less progress through within class attainment groupings, and your higher prior attaining pupils will make more progress. So again, beware the floor of averages with those, because that certainly isn't consistent across your class. One-to-one tuition we've talked about, a small group tuition we have as well. Learning styles, another example of sort of, the need to click in and find out a little bit more within the field of cognitive science. There's some suggestions that teaching to learning styles is actually a really low impact approach. However, it's reported as plus 2 months because every study is reported. If you were to click into the meta-analyses on that strand, not everything that's reported within there is actually to do with learning styles. It's often to do with individualised instruction. Setting or streaming, if you're from a school that's more than one form entry and you're to set or stream across the classes, the likely average prior impact of that was -1 month. So the children actually make less progress through that approach than if you weren't to do it. But just some, again, starting points for conversation, some possible links you might want to click onto. Now, we all know that academic attainment isn't going to be the only barrier facing some of our learners when they return to school. There's another whole section of the toolkit which aren't so much about targeted support for academic attainment, but they're more levers to attainment, so things that need to be in place in order for children to be able to learn well. And within here, if you were looking at how to use some of the catch-up premium or indeed pupil premium to support children making accelerated progress, social and emotional learning approaches is a really good place to start. So yes, they're moderate cost, middle cost. However, there's quite an extensive evidence base, and you get a fairly moderate impact for that of +4 months. There is a guidance report, which if you want to know a little bit more about the content of the guidance report, get in touch with anybody from the Aspira Research School to find out a little bit more. Behaviour-based interventions, again, can be +3 months. You'll all, I'm sure, be able to think of children you'll be working with whose behaviour was perhaps tricky before lockdown and maybe even more tricky post-lockdown. On the opposite end of the scale within their aspiration interventions for a reasonably long period of time now within the teaching learning toolkit have been shown to have no impact upon academic attainment. And therefore, if you were looking at non-academic support for children and more those levers to attainment, that would be a reflection point. And again, starting points for conversation within your team. This slide and the next slide obviously look really similar to what we've just looked at, but these are the early years toolkit. So it's great now. The teaching and learning toolkit is split. The teaching and learning toolkit covers the whole of the primary and secondary age phase, whereas there is now an early years toolkit as well that covers the meta-analyses that are specific to early years. So again, you can see I've ordered it by impact. So you've got some of the highest impact approaches there: early maths, early numeracy approaches are high impact for very low cost, and there's an extensive evidence base there. Same for communication and language. You may want to click in over the inset day. Megan Dixon is doing a session on the importance of some of the approaches that can be used for early communication and language in the early years. So again, it might be useful to click into there. But if you want to have a look down these, and on the next slide there is a link to the early years toolkit, so you may find it useful again to pause at that point and go and have an explore, particularly if you're teaching in nursery or reception, or indeed in year one, given as your year one pupils will have missed half or a third, more than a third of their time in reception. So very similar to before, same principles, but these are early years approaches. This slide's in if you're a bit of a data geek like me and you want to know where some of those +3 months, -1 month, etc., come from. Now this is not the most up to date. This is a screenshot from about 12 months ago now. But this shows you, I'm going to be very technical and call them red blobs. Each red blob is a meta-analysis. So a meta-analysis is where there's a group of studies, a group of trials that have been conducted, and an average effect size has been calculated for that group of studies. Each group of studies is one blob. And obviously you can see that for each strand in the teaching and learning toolkit, there's a number of red blobs. There's a number of meta-analyses because the teaching and learning toolkit is a meta-analysis. So for example, if you were to take, perhaps let's look at behavior interventions, you can see that there is one meta-analysis, one group of studies, which had a negative impact. There's a whole load of studies clustered around the sort of lower to medium impact. Whereas there is one red blob, one meta-analysis far out to the right, and that means that group of studies has a really high impact on outcomes for learners. The line that runs down the centre of the page is an effect size of 0, so it didn't have a positive effect, it didn't have a negative effect, it had no impact, it was no different. So any blobs to the left of that line show that there was a negative impact on outcomes for learners through that meta-analysis, and any to the right show there was a positive, and the further extreme, the more positive or more negative it was. Again, if you want to know a little bit more about that, then any of the colleagues at the Aspira Research School will be more than happy to talk to you about those in a little bit more depth. So the Teaching and Learning Toolkit, as we've explained, gives you sort of headline themes of approaches rather than individual approaches. However, the EEF to date have funded over 150 evaluations now of approaches. The examples on here being things like switch on reading, using self-regulation to improve writing, catch-up numeracy, for example, so individual approaches. And one thing that's worthy of note there is that actually all reports are published. If the EEF have trialled something, whether it's positive, whether it's negative, whether it's neutral, they're all published. So if you actually want to know a little bit more about one individual approach, it's worth having a look for the report on that funded trial or that funded evaluation to find out more about an individual approach. That can be found on the EEF's website as well. Another source of evidence that there is, again, can be found on the EEF's website. You'll see the link to this page at the top of this slide. Is the Education Endowment Foundation have produced a series of guidance reports, and the guidance reports are linked to areas where there's a larger body of evidence usually. So there are those for literacy, so right from preparing for literacy in the early years, Key Stage 1 literacy, Key Stage 2 literacy, secondary literacy. There's maths, so improving maths in early years in Key Stage 1 and improving maths in Key Stages 2 and 3. There's secondary science. There's those some around those levers to attainment, so things like social and emotional learning, behaviour, metacognition, special educational needs. On the next slide, you'll see some more screenshots of some of the guidance reports there are, and also within that it will always tell you the guidance reports that are coming up as well. So if you look on the next slide, you'll be able to see a couple of others that are coming up in the future. The guidance reports, when you look at those, are all presented in a really similar way. There will have been a large sort of literature study done, or research evidence summary study done around the body of evidence that there is available, and then based on those there will be a series of recommendations, the things that within that field are most likely to have a high impact upon outcomes for learners, and each of those recommendations will have maybe anything from 2 to 8 pages of information in there to give you some idea about how to implement those. As you can see on here, the ones that are coming soon is there's going to be an update to the Key Stage 1 Literacy Guidance Report. That's going to be published this term, and the long-awaited feedback guidance report with a focus predominantly on the early years is coming in summer. So it says in summer, so not too long to wait. Another link that I've put within here is the Putting Evidence to Work, a School's Guide to Implementation is the most read guidance report that there's ever been. And it's kind of that Bananarama principle of it ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it. Sorry for those of you who are younger and have got no idea what I'm talking about with Bananarama, but it's about the fact that yes, you can have an amazing approach, but if you don't implement it really well, then you're still unlikely to have a good impact. And what there is that's a more recent addition is there is, in fact, a short course online about the implementation guidance report. So if you don't have time to sit and read it, digest it, discuss it with colleagues, it could be worth over the course of a few weeks perhaps doing that online course. It's really easy to follow and really easy to think through, and breaks it down nicely for you. So the link's on this slide. So we're moving on now to sources of evidence beyond the Education Endowment Foundation. I know that the Education Endowment Foundation is one of the most widely known sources of evidence for education, but there's loads of other sources of evidence as well. There is a publication called Best Evidence in Brief. It has been around again. I may even be about a year out of date now. It's probably more like 8 years now that that's been out for. But essentially, you can have that sent to you. There is the website there, beib.org.uk, where you can sign up to receive that publication. It comes from the Institute for Effective Education, based at York University, and it's again sort of a summary of the studies that have been published that are of note and are of interest. And you can also go on to beib.org.uk and actually search for studies. So if you want to know about studies in a certain area, you don't have to wait and hope that they come out through the fortnightly publication. You can actually go onto that database of studies and search. It's a really, really good tool. I also find the Institute for Effective Education amazing. When you ring them, they pick up the phone and they're always happy to talk to you if you're wanting to know more information about a certain area or a certain approach. Another lesser known source of evidence, but that is really, really useful, is evidence for impact. You can see the website link at the top. I've simply screenshot it from my browser, and it's evidenceForImpact.org.uk. And what that does, similar to the Education Endowment Foundation, is it is a database essentially of studies that have been done of different approaches. So I've screenshot a couple of sections of the screen there. You can have a look and see how it works. Again, I'm going to suggest that possibly after the next slide after this one, that it might be worthwhile stopping, having a look at Best Evidence in Brief and having a look at Evidence for Impact and having a quick play around so that you know how to use that prior to moving on. But you can see, you can click on whether you're primary, whether you're secondary, you can click on a subject and it will tell you every approach that has been trialed in that area. It will tell you, and it will tell you whether there's been an impact or not. I'm going to show you an example of that on the next screen. So you can see here I simply clicked under primary onto reading, and you can see when you click on there that you've got 3 approaches that come out with strong progress in primary. I mean, that's quite shocking. Only 3 approaches that have been evaluated actually have been evaluated to have a strong impact. One of them's reading recovery, one of them's accelerated reader, and one of them is success for all. So those 3 approaches, if you were, for example, post-COVID thinking as a school or as a teacher or as a team, how might we spend this catch-up premium to support some of our learners? They would be somewhere that you might look at as a starting point. There are other approaches which maybe had moderate impact rather than strong, but I thought it was interesting as well to click on and screenshot for you the fact that if you click on no impact, just as useful as those which give you strong impact are the ones that give you no impact. It could be that your school is using reciprocal reading, Shine on a Saturday, Switch On, whatever it might be, that you might be using one of those approaches, or that you might be considering using one of those approaches with the COVID catch-up premium or with pupil premium perhaps. And again, those have been evaluated in this country for primary reading and have all been shown to have no impact. So again, it's a snapshot in time, but certainly I'd be looking at those studies and looking at those trials before I made that decision. Again, I'm gonna suggest you stop and pause at this point and have a little bit of a play around with evidence for impact and a little bit of a play around on best evidence in brief, and then return to the next slide when you're done with those. So as we come towards the end of this short session, I wanted to sort of finish off by giving you an idea of some of the different types of evidence that there are out there. A lot of practitioners say that they are evidence-informed practitioners when actually the sum total of what they may use might be hearing the opinions of other people on Twitter, for example, or media articles, or anecdotal things, so evidence from other schools. However, there is sort of a hierarchies of evidence here around, around the sort of from the highest quality of evidence to the lowest quality, and that might be something that some of you are ready to start thinking about now, or it might be something that you think that you want to return back to later in the year. But basically, a meta-analysis, which is where, if you remember, a whole group of studies were grouped together to get an average effect size, or a systematic review, so where you haven't randomly selected studies where you can be a bit biased and pick out things that support your view, but where you've gone into something like, say, Google Scholar, like an online scholarly library, and entered search terms, and it has produced for you the papers that you should look at. Those are the highest impact. Just closely followed by them would be randomized controls trials or matched comparison design trials. I don't have time to talk about all of these different types today, but a really good person to speak to about those would be either Megan Dixon or Mark Avis. I'm sure Mark Avis won't mind me saying he's got a brilliant analogy to different types of plastic bags to describe to you what all of these things are, which I'm sure he'll be happy to share. The next down might be sort of a really theory-based piece, but a really sound theory behind it. The next stage is sort of the independent research, so things like surveys, data analysis, interviews, etc. Going down to things where there's been some in-house evaluation, but it hasn't been more robust or wide. Expert opinion, we could debate who the expert might be, or media articles, and your social media goes within there as well. One document that will be within this section of the INSET website is I've sent a link through, which is to the Institute for Effective Education's Engaging with Evidence guide. It's not a really big guide, and it is really, really useful, and it will tell you a little bit more about some of those different sources of evidence. Really useful. It's still my go-to document that I use a lot. Myself and with others. So that's really worth a look either now or at the end a little bit later. Again, with this page, some of this is within the IE's Engaging with Evidence guide. There isn't lots of time to discuss this today. I know I said I'd sort of limit this around about sort of no more than an hour, and I know you'll have a busy inset day and I don't want to go over, but just so that you've got this for the future, something to look out for when you're looking at sources of evidence is to whether there's any red flags, and they're here, but just to sort of touch on a couple. Some of the red flags can be around the author. No author of an approach that they've designed themselves and stand to make money out of is going to publish a negative report about themselves. So it's really important to think whether it's been done independently or whether there was any vested interest there as well. That's something that's really important to look at. In terms of the literature or evidence reviews, if you see somebody writing a research piece and they only reference things that back up their own view, that could be a bit of a red flag, because there must be some contradictory evidence somewhere out there, and within that, if the person's deliberately citing some reasonably poor quality studies but just to back up their view, something you might be a bit alarmed about. In terms of research methods, if you're looking at a piece of evidence and somebody's making these great claims, I looked at one recently, it was this really great claim about this approach. And when I looked, the sample size that was being referred to was 5 children. It's really difficult to kind of draw conclusions from something that was with 5 children in one school, for example. So that's something that's worth having a look at. If there's lots of participants drop out, again, that can be a little bit alarming, because maybe the approach is almost impossible to implement, and that's why so many people are dropping out. Or actually, maybe people are dropping out who aren't supporting the outcome that the researcher was hoping to get. Either way, there's lots that you can think about within there. And the last is in terms of data analysis and conclusions. You don't want, for example, somebody to be doing trialing an approach that is intended to really improve outcomes for learners in maths, and then them conclude that that approach is amazing at improving attendance, for example, because what they're then really looking at doing then is trying to look at something that just happened to correlate, and they're trying to say A caused B just because they want to report something positive from what they've done. There are a couple of little comical cartoons at the side here. The first one being, the child is eating a cat, yet the mother's saying, "I'm worried, doctor, our cats keep disappearing, and I think the grief is affecting my son's weight." So having a look at whether things are correlating or whether one's causing the others. And beware the kind of data analysis in the graphs of way things can be presented. This is real. You can actually show that if you eat more cheese, it correlates with the likelihood of dying by being tangled in your bed sheets. The likelihood of those things actually being A causes B seems fairly slim, but there's a lot of ways in which data can correlate. Again, that's a 3-minute perhaps way of describing something that's quite complex. If you want to talk to any of the ELEs at Aspira or any of the core team at Aspira, they'll be more than happy to talk to you a little bit more about some of those red flags. I've simply put this slide in because I've been asked, I would say probably 10 or more times in the last 2 years, people saying, well, I've read this piece of evidence and it gives me an effect size, and I don't really know whether that's good or not. So this simply is here as something for you to reference in the future. If it tells you it's an effect size of 0.27 and you're thinking, is that good? Is that not good? That gives you an idea here of whether it's good or not. So some of you may find that useful. Some of you may never look at it again, and that's fine. So we've talked through the Teaching and Learning Toolkit on the EEF's website, the Early Years Toolkit, guidance reports, evaluation reports, all of those on the Education Endowment Foundation's website. We've talked about best evidence in brief and that sort of database of studies on there, as well as the fortnightly publication. And we've also talked about evidence for impact and being able to look at individual approaches, evaluations on there. Those are just some really easily accessible, really easy to understand and presented with teachers in mind. Sources of evidence. There are loads more. There's lots of people and there's lots of organisations that are interested in evidence in terms of education. And there's just some here. The IES, the What's Works Clearinghouse, really, really useful. Evidence-Based Teachers Network, for example, as well, or evidence-based education as well. There's the Centre for Evaluation and Monitoring that some of you might want to look at. ResearchEd as well, and the Chartered College of Teaching. And again, you can sign up to their, I'm sorry, I don't remember if it's weekly or fortnightly newsletter. And again, they'll send out research pieces and evidence summaries for you, but there are lots of places to look. And actually as well, you're all tuning into this because you are part of Aspire Educational Trust, and we have a research school, Aspira, so utilise Aspire. If you're thinking, I have this group of learners for whom I think I know this is a barrier for post-COVID, and you're wondering about the best approach to use for catch-up, just get in touch with Aspira, with with Steve Wielden, with Megan Dixon, Mark Avis, Kevin, a whole series of people will be able to help you. But pop onto the website and we're more than happy to have individual conversations. I hope you found that useful. I hope I've come in within the hour as well that I said I would. And yeah, good luck with it all and enjoy. Thank you.